From inside Visual Studio, we are going to create a new MVC project. So we want to make sure the language is C#. And to only show MVC, we're going to do a little search. And we want the ASP.NET Web Application.NET Framework with C#. So we're going to select that one and hit Next. For a name, we are going to call this one MVC Music Store. As far as where you're going to save that, again, if you're on campus, you're going to want a jump drive or your Q drive. If you're at home, you can put it in the default location. That's fine. For this first assignment, we are not going to worry about putting anything on GitHub. That'll come next week. And we do want to put the solution file inside our project folder. So we're going to go ahead and click Create. And here we do want MVC, but we want a little more for defaults. So we're going to change the authentication. So instead of no authentication, we're going to use individual user accounts. Now this will allow users to register, so they can create an account and authenticate that way. But in MVC, there's also a way to authenticate using Facebook, Google, Twitter, all of that. And I'm sure you guys have seen that. We will get into authentication later in the semester. But if it is something that you eventually want to do in an application, you do want to make sure that you turn it on. Because if you don't turn it on, it's hard to add it after the fact. Okay, you end up manually trying to add it, and it's not as good as what comes with MVC. So most applications are using individual user accounts. You can also choose the work or school, which are organizational accounts. So these would authenticate using some type of Active Directory. This, where you see this would be when you authenticate with Microsoft, and it asks you if this is a work or school account or a personal account. Okay, that's the type of thing you're looking at there. And then Windows authentication, that would be more for an intranet. And in our database class, when we set up SQL Server to run locally, we use Windows authentication for that. Okay, so for most of your MVC, you are going to pick individual user. So we're going to go ahead and click OK. And then we're going to turn on unit testing as well. Okay, and then we're going to go ahead and click Create. And this should take a little longer than your first one because it's actually doing quite a bit more. It's adding controllers for that authentication and registration. It also has to add some models because it's going to use those models to store the registration information in a database, and it's having to do quite a few more views. So I'm going to go ahead and, oh, that came back quicker than I thought. So let's take a look quick at the controllers. So before, when we did not have authentication and unit testing, all we had was a home controller. And now we have an account controller for the authentication, and we also have a manage controller. Before, we did not have any models, and now we have several. And these are all basically for that whole authentication and registration component. And in addition, we have several more views. So we still have our home view, but we also have an account and a manage view. So I'm going to take another look at this directory structure just so you understand what you are looking at. So up top here, we have the name of our application. Then we have quite a few folders, and we've taken a look at controllers and views in more detail. And we've talked a little about models. And basically, these are classes and they're going to be used for data. So if we take a look at these, and these all deal with managing or registering your account. So when you authenticate, if you don't use Facebook or Google Mail, you can actually fill out a form and submit registration material, and that's what this does. And so you can see these are all classes. And then we have our variables, which when we combine this with entity framework, this becomes the basis for our tables. Entity framework will take these classes and it will generate tables. And with the tables, it will generate our columns. Okay, so it'll do that automatically when we pull in entity framework. And we're actually going to get into doing that in just a few weeks. So you're going to see how all of this works and how it connects. Okay, but these classes should look familiar to you, hopefully. And you'll see that there's a lot of attributes associated here. And we are going to cover how to set all of that up. Okay, so at this point, what you need to know about the model is that it's made up of classes. When we combine this with entity framework, it will generate your database tables for you based on those classes. And views are the part of the UI that you see. And we're familiar with the home view. You can see when we added the account, how many views that it created. And here's one for registering, logging in. Here are some that handle forgotten passwords. This is why if you think that you want people to log in, you want to make sure you turn on authentication because it's doing a ton of work for you. Now let's take a look at some of these folders up top that we haven't looked at yet. So we have app data. And this is where you're going to store the data files that you want to read or write. So right now, there's nothing in there. Then we've got app start. So this is where all of the configuration files go. And next week, we'll be actually taking a look at some of them. You'll notice that there's one called route config, and this is used by the controllers. That is one that we are actually going to look at next week. We already took a look at content, and this is where your images are going to go. You'll notice that our Bootstrap CSS is in here. Any kind of CSS that you want to create and use would go in here in addition to graphic images. You'll notice that we have fonts. These are all glyphicons because you can add those, and you will be learning how to add those. If you had any kind of additional fonts that you wanted to use, they would go into this folder. As far as adding fonts, you add them through your CSS, just like you do in regular web pages. Scripts. So this is where the actual Bootstrap code is located and jQuery. You'll notice that we also have Modernizer, which at this point isn't really being used. Modernizer more comes into play when you have major changes in HTML, CSS, that kind of thing. If a browser does not recognize newer commands, it is used to handle it. So you do want to keep it in here because eventually HTML changes, probably won't for a while, but that's the purpose of Modernizer. And these files at the bottom, especially the web config, we will be looking at later in the semester. And let's see, that's pretty much all you need to know at this point. And we've already talked a little bit about convention. Convention is important in MVC. MVC makes a lot of assumptions when it sets up the scaffolding, which is all the code that it creates automatically for you. And a lot of the conventions deal with when you go to a particular controller and you execute an action method, what view does it automatically go to? And we took a look at the home controller. But if you look at the account controller, you can see it's kind of set up the same way. Account controller is derived from controller. All of the methods are public methods because those are the ones that you can access from the browser. If you have a private method, you can't access that from the browser. That would be something that you would use only internally. So here we've got something called User Manager. And so under Views and Account, if we look here, this was probably a bad example because it's not actually going to a view. So let's look at a different one. Here's Login. Okay, so we have Login and it's returning a view. So that is automatically going to go to the Login view. Okay, and then if we look in another one, so verify code. If we look here, there is a verify code view, okay, and they are connected. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about conventions.